Hmm.
Okay, so you heard that recording in progress?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so today I'm chatting with econoboi. He is a social democratic capitalist YouTuber who is, I think, famous and I think who is fantastic in, I think, charitably defending capitalism, from, I think, more socialist leaning people. Do you have something more to say about yourself, econoboi?
Yeah, sure. I guess I wouldn't really consider myself strictly capitalist or socialist. I just, typical social democrat, believe in kind of a mixed production model where, I kind of try to just look at what are the types of institutions that, work in various contexts. It's probably not the case that private market distribution works in every single potential scenario. And it's also probably not the case that collective ownership or decommodification works in every single scenario either. Sometimes markets are really good, sometimes they're really bad, sometimes private ownership's really good, sometimes it's probably not very good. So,
Okay, okay. Great. I mean, I think social democrats, considering their mixed, like their view that's like they support mixed economy rather than fully either like worker ownership or ownership of the means of production or like community ownership, which is I think the socialist view, and I guess fully capitalist view would be like almost everything is private, privatized, right? Like I think David
sure.
Friedman would say like everything is privatized, right? There is
Yeah,
no state or government involvement in literally anything. So there's no state. So
right.
so I would say like uh, I consider like all these all these different, I think four different political views or ideologies, like these, like social democracy is one, social liberalism is two, neoliberalism is three, and libertarian capitalism as fourth one, right? At least in in our discussion, we are not concerned with I think socialism, but I think it will come up during this chat, I guess. So one of the things, the reason why I do not support like a mixed economy, and I fully support, I think, capitalism to the point of like agreeing with like David Friedman and Brian Kaplan, which is I think zero state capitalism, right? Like full capitalism. So like
Mhm.
to quickly tell you my reasons is that it seems to me that like you would already agree that there are some things that capitalism does fantastically, right? Like selling cars or like food markets, right? And like electronic stuff, right? Like mobile phones, smartphones, computers, PCs, right? It does fantastic in that. And there are economic theory based reasons for that, right? Like you have competition there, you have like every company has like an objective which is just profit maximization, right? And they're like in competition with each other, and um they seem to be these sorts of things like market competition and a profit motive. This they seem to be really fantastic in generating in maximizing well-being, right? I guess I should just say total well-being. So now of course market failures exist, and the social democratic view, that I think your view is that in those market failures government can do reasonably, right? Like fixing that, or like providing an alternative, uh, a reasonable alternative uh, to like in those locations where market failures exist, right? So my view to that, like my answer to that is that sure, market failures exist, right? But I think government failures also existed. I think you will probably also acknowledge this too. And when I compare like market failures, their frequency, right, and government failures and their frequency, along with the fact that like you sure, market failures will lead to suboptimal outcomes, right? Not it will not lead to economic efficiency, but government trying to fix market failures does seem to mess things up more, right? Like housing regulations and stuff like that. I think like like housing crisis is happening in like Canada and United States, right? And that is like an obvious like in like a I shouldn't say obvious, but like it's like ultimately due to housing regulations like zoning, right? Height restrictions, single family housing allocations and stuff like that, like very strict regulations and rules, right, that government placed, right? If you leave it up to the market, I think you would have a much better like maximization of well-being. So yeah, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of disagree with a lot of the premises. So,
Oh,
um, to start, I think that you end up falling into a trap, I think that a lot of socialists will say, which is that, well, if the good thing about capitalism is profit maximization and market competition, you can have that in a socialist framework, right? You can have socialist markets, market socialism, right? And so if it's the case that the thing that makes capitalism good is profiteering and market competition, those aren't necessarily unique to capitalist production. You could also imagine a state-owned enterprise doing the same thing, within a market framework, or sovereign wealth ownership, doing the exact same thing, right? So there's got to be something more unique to the capitalist, right, that provides value than just sort of operating in a context of competition and profiteering. And so that's probably number one. To me, what I would say to that criticism of a socialist is like, well, we can have market competition and profiteering within cooperative ownership or social ownership of various forms, is that there's probably some sort of creative destruction element associated with private ownership that provides a utility. That if you look into the studies, for instance, of public and private research, right, that I think that this could maybe be a good analogy of like pharmaceuticals, right? Where it seems like what a capitalist funded pharmaceutical research does really well is really, really efficiently maximize treatments for diseases, especially treatments that are broadly applicable to society. I mean, naturally, like a $1 billion company is probably not going to research some incredibly niche disease that only like three people have. However, the government could probably spend millions of dollars researching that same thing to
yeah.
help those three people or any subsequent people that have that disease. That seems to be what their literature reflects. And so there's a level of capital efficiency that it seems like capitalist ownership tends towards that's unique and not exactly applicable to different socialist, frames of ownership. I think that there's also sort of capacity problems with you could say capacity problems, but essentially there's probably sort of macroeconomic problems with total socialization of investment, at least from the history that I've read, when investment is mostly or entirely socialized. I don't necessarily know if I'd say mostly, but when investment is entirely or nearly entirely socialized, it seems like you have problems with overinvestment in underperforming industries. And perhaps this goes to what you were saying, where maybe democracy just kind of fails in certain regards, right? Or maybe socialist economic systems and governments fail in certain regards. This is my biggest criticism for Matt Brunig's ideology, which is that Matt Brunig has an incredibly airtight theoretical case. It's probably the most robust socialist model, economically speaking, that I've ever heard of. But his model relies on universal ownership. And, his kind of response to, well, wouldn't a universal owner sort of historically fall into the same pitfalls of overinvesting in underperforming industries? His response to that is kind of unsatisfying, which is, well, but a universal owner is incentivized to invest only in the most efficient things, right? And it's like, well, in theory, that's true, right? I mean, in theory, if, society owned all capital collectively, they wouldn't want to invest in underperforming things. But we can take an example today, like, look at how many people on the Republican side support tariffs because they protect underperforming sort of bases of manufacturing in this country, right? Like, why do aluminum companies go out of business in America? Because you can get cheaper aluminum elsewhere, right? I mean, plain and simple. So it seems like people are willing to support that kind of thing. So having capitalist investment is probably a good thing. So that's kind of where I would start out as having a basis for at least some capitalist ownership within an economy. And then with regards to the second thing that you said, with regards to market failures versus public sort of, government failures,
Yeah.
again, I think that this is where the mixed model just makes more sense to me, where obviously there are probably some things that the government can't do very well. For instance, when it comes to centrally planning, food production and distribution, that's probably not something that you would want the government to do. Now, at the same time, you might want the government to regulate, say, how those food producers manage their waste or affect local environments, right? I mean, that seems like probably a reasonable place for the government to come in because at the same time that you can have efficient production and allocation of food in a relatively private market capitalist framework, you can also protect the environment from potential blight or pollution and things like that. And it seems like governments have a pretty strong track record of protecting the environment and probably leading to some efficiencies. For every problem with the government, I can point you to another government that doesn't have that problem. And so, insofar as that's the case, I would just advocate for the types of government institutions that are good, and I would not advocate for the types of government institutions that are bad. But I certainly wouldn't say that the government is like too risky of an institution to have in the first place, because it seems provable that governments can work and they can work pretty well.
Okay, okay, okay. Nice. Fantastic. Okay. So yeah, I wrote some of the uh, like in my notes, you know.
Yeah.
Uh, so I was listening to you. I was just writing some of the stuff you're saying in my notes. So okay, yeah. I mean, it is like understandable what you're saying, right? I think social democrats uh, say stuff that is understandable, reasonable, right? But now, one of the things we talked about, so yeah, I should have clarified also. I should have also said like private property, right? Like that is an important thing about capitalism, right? Like private property,
Yep.
private ownership of the means of production too,
Correct.
right? So
Yeah,
I
I call it capitalist ownership, but we're talking about the same thing.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, capitalist ownership, you could say, yeah, yeah. So so uh I think you talked about like capacity problems with totally socialized investment, right?
Hmm.
Like you talked about problems with Brunig's version of sovereign wealth funds, right? Uh, yeah. So one of the things about like when we're discussing government failures and market failures is that sure, some places governments do well, right? They do seem to, like as you said, right? They do seem to protect the environment and deal with climate change, right? Yeah, sure. But one of the thing is that like I don't know if the market, like capitalists will do worse necessarily, because like like one of the, so climate change is, I know that like one of the major criticisms of like capitalism, right? From I think socialist side, from even social democrats, even social liberals, right? I think even neoliberals like support I think some sort of government intervention for dealing with climate change and like protecting the environment. Yeah, I get that. But like my view is that I think like capitalist firms will still like, if there was no government, right? Or if the government was still minimal, right? I think the capitalist firms, right, like the bigger firms, I think eventually what's going to happen is that those firms will make, I think, a sort of contracts, certain kinds of contracts, right? That they would agree with each other that they are not going to pollute as much, right? Eventually that kind of stuff will happen. I think they will like voluntarily, all sorts of corporations will voluntarily try to switch to more cleaner energies, right? Like solar and also and that kind of stuff. Now, of course, it is not in the self-interest of the the polluting companies, right? Like the fossil fuel companies, right? And that's true. But I think what's going to happen is that if the majority of firms, right, realize this, right, like this kind of information is like shared, I think they will likely deal with
Mhm.
climate change and try to, try to encourage fossil fuel firms to sort of switch to this business, right? Sort of
Mhm.
switch to this business. But yeah, I think that's my view. I think that's likely going to happen. But I do want to acknowledge that, yeah, like international sort of international organizations like Paris, I think like Kyoto protocols and like Paris agreements between countries. I think that is like international institutions have done something good. And my view is that I think those international institutions would always form, right? Those international institutions, even in capitalism, will always
Mhm.
form, right? Because I think uh, that it is not in the self-interest of fossil fuel industry, but it is in the self-interest of pretty much every
Mhm.
other capitalist firm, right,
Right.
to deal with climate change. So that's my one that's my view with respect to climate change and capitalism, right?
Mhm.
Now, I think you talked about like governments sometimes doing good and like dealing properly with market failures, right? But I think the public choice economic theory, uh, right? I think the public choice pose, I think, like problems for that view. And I think along with that, right, like whenever so so like healthcare, I think you would say like healthcare is like paradigmatic market failure, and the governments do a fantastic job in that, right? Like Canada, UK, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, right? Nordic model, and basically the social democratic models, right? Which is that they have like significant market interventions. But I should mention, right, like there are some major drawbacks, right?
Yep.
So my friend, his name is Matthew Edelstein. He wrote something. I'm just trying to find his articles. I think he said that a lot of innovation in drugs, right, in medicine, happen in the United States, right? Like
Mhm.
significant innovations. A lot of innovations happen in the United States. But like in other places, in social democratic places, the market, at least parts of those markets, are significantly like regulated, right? Or like have certain, I think, price controls set, right, with respect to medicine and drugs, right? That that basically disincentivize the profit making companies because, well, they're unable to generate profit, right? So let me
Mhm.
just find it quickly. So that is, I think he said 73% of I think that's his paper, pharmaceutical. Just a second. Yeah, Contra Iglesias on pharmaceutical profits. Yeah. So um, 78%, the 78, so this is why as of 2017, of the new drugs that were genuinely novel, 78% come from the US first. The US is responsible overall for about half of new drugs. But of the new novel drugs, the vast majority come from US price controls. Wait, yeah, the vast majority come from US price controls, specially depressed. Wait, what? Oh, sorry. There's a full stop there. There's a full stop there. I skipped. So yeah, there's a full stop there. And after he says that price controls especially depress the kind of innovation innovation of important drugs because the drugs are the riskiest but have the highest payouts. So my view is that, like, at least with respect to healthcare, right? I think one thing you can do is like you should privatize healthcare industry. And Brian Kaplan has also like a few more things to say about like privatizing healthcare industry, right? So Brian Kaplan says like okay, so Brian Kaplan acknowledges this, right? Like in healthcare sector, most people, including economists, think that free market logic fails. The main complaints are high cost. Healthcare is ridiculously expensive. Externalities. My health depends my health depends on your health and vice versa. Moral hazard. Health insurance encourages unhealthy lifestyles and risky behaviors. Adverse selection. People with bad health are more likely to buy insurance, which raises rates, which makes healthy people even less likely to buy insurance. Consumer ignorance and irrationality. People don't know much about health and it's costly to learn. Even worse, they make systematic mistakes and blindly trust authorities. So Brian Kaplan acknowledges these sorts of like market failures in healthcare industry, and his solutions quickly is that high cost is due to like mountain of regulations. You should like deregulate, like medical licenses also greatly increases the cost of doctors. I think Milton Friedman also thought that the licensing of doctors and like the amount of effort they need to put in for like getting their medical license is like absurd. Uh, so like Brian Kaplan also thinks that like medical personnel seems to be qualified, right? Regulation makes it hard to sell catastrophic and low cost insurance policies. So that's his reply to high cost. His reply to
Yeah.
moral hazard is like insurance encourages unhealthy lifestyles and risky behavior if everyone pays the same rates. But in the free market, insurers would charge riskier customers higher rates. So why don't they? Because regulators often tie their hands in the interest of fairness. Adverse selection. The least healthy people buy the most insurance if everyone pays equal rates. But again, free market solution is to charge riskier customers higher rates. Governments habitually create adverse selection problems by trying to equalize rates, banning pre-existing conditions clauses, and so on. Consumer
Mhm.
ignorance and irrationality. So Brian Kaplan's answer to consumer ignorance and irrationality is that if consumer ignorance were the problem, government could easily solve it with a good website. What about deeper problems of systematic error and blind trust? They're both very real. They are both very real, right? So Brian Kaplan again acknowledging the concerns of social democrats, right? And then Brian Kaplan says, but argue against government involvement, right? They're both very real, but argue against government involvement. If you take any decent health econ class, you will hear about a pile of research showing that we greatly overestimate the health benefits of medicine and put too much trust in medical authorities. The government's response encourages us to use more medicine and remove financial incentives to second guess the experts. So
Mhm.
I think that I guess that's his sort of like that's his
Yeah.
response to healthcare. So sorry, government intervention in healthcare industry. David Friedman has even a bigger, like a bigger essay or article on that, and David Friedman I think goes into much more detail, right? So I can read that, but I think I'm speaking too much so far, so I'm just going to leave something of I just want you to
Yeah.
speak to. So yeah,
Yeah.
what
No,
is
I
your
mean,
reply to that? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think on the pollution issue specifically, the first thing that you mentioned, it's really not clear to me that there would be industry-wide coordination on this issue. I mean, part of moral hazard that you mentioned on the healthcare issue, part of that on the industry side as well is, I guess fundamentally moral hazard is just when you're insulated from the risks that you're taking, right? Or you're insulated from the consequences of what you're doing. And in the case of pollution's classic example, you're insulated from the consequences of the pollution that you're emitting. After all, if you could make $1 million today by polluting, say, the air that broadly, maybe there's like one atom of particulate that we all have to deal with aggregately, so we barely notice it. But you could make $1 million today by just putting one particulate per person of, pollution in the air. Most people are going to do that, right? It's sort of a collective action problem. It's just a way that individual incentives don't quite align appropriately. And history is filled with examples of governments, putting regulations on certain pollutants and basically the problem being solved, right? I mean, look at the issue with the ozone layer. That was such a big issue in like the early 2000s. Oh, we're gonna get rid of the ozone layer, and presumably that's pretty bad, right? Because you basically wouldn't be able to go outside without the ozone layer. And the governments of the world kind of came together, said, hey, this certain, I think it was like a part of aerosol that we used at the time is basically what's eroding the ozone layer. Governments band together, ban it. They just tell private industry it's banned, you can't do it anymore, figure out something else. And industry figures out something else, which maybe is marginally worse for their profits, but ultimately led to the recovery of the ozone layer. And then there's many other, niche examples, maybe preventing deforestation or, taxing pollution, and we end up resulting in less pollution. Take the United States, which has subsidized renewables for the last couple decades. We end up having decarbonization while at the same time that we have economic expansion and innovation. And that's a good thing. Pollution is bad, right? And so
Yeah.
I think again, this is just an area where the government clearly has an ability to make a positive impact. And I can kind of link that to your discussion on healthcare. Obviously, the government has an ability to make a negative impact, but for instance, of all the universal healthcare programs in the world, not all of them are total public ownership of healthcare, right? You've got like the
Yeah.
NHS, which is essentially government, sort of healthcare run as a government service,
Yeah.
right? Where government employees or state employees. I'm not sure how it works in many other countries, but we can take the Netherlands and Switzerland as examples. Healthcare is totally private in those countries, right? Totally private insurance. There's not a huge amount of state-run
I mean,
hospitals. There's not a
government
huge amount
is
of
still there, I think,
no,
significant.
exactly right. But there's a difference between public ownership and operation and just regulation.
Yeah.
Because again, this is an example in the Netherlands and Switzerland. It's an example of private market competition being taken advantage of, or at least that fundamental dynamic being taken advantage of. A lot of people reference Singapore as well, where you can take advantage of that fundamental dynamic of private ownership, private investment, market competition, while at the same time recognizing that there's a lot of market failures that need to be plugged in order to have a functioning health insurance market. You mentioned innovation. Of course, it's the case that the United States innovates a lot. The studies that I've seen on that show that, at least with regards to pharmaceutical innovation, a lot of that's just a simple function of spending, right? The U.S. spends a lot on pharmaceutical innovation, and so therefore they, end up innovating a lot on pharmaceutical innovation. With regards to how we regulate IP laws and how much we invest in pharmaceuticals, that's sort of agnostic to whether or not we have public or private ownership of different sort of aspects of our healthcare system. And like I said, there's a way to orient our healthcare insurance system in a way that doesn't sort of necessarily degrade pharmaceutical innovation. After all, I mean, we're just talking about health insurance, right? I mean, the health insurance as a market is separate from healthcare as a service, and it's certainly separate from pharmaceutical research. And so maybe that's a debate worth having. Like, should we, some socialists will say that we should totally nationalize and decommodify sort of pharmaceuticals from the top down. But from a social democratic perspective, I think at least contemporary social democratic perspective, what we would tend to recognize or tend to advocate for is just the idea that, yeah, I mean, we should probably have health insurance as a government service or a public option because health insurance itself probably doesn't have much room for innovation. It's just a reimbursement system fundamentally. I mean, it's not, how do you innovate so much from offering health insurance? And even if you wanted private health insurance, you can still maintain that and have a well-functioning market. You can look at the Netherlands, you can look at Switzerland, you can look at Singapore for that. And so that's kind of where the flexibility kind of comes in. I think that the biggest downside, and I don't know if I didn't know Brian Kaplan was a total like anarcho-capitalist or something, but at least David Friedman I know is an anarcho-capitalist, and I
Yeah.
think that's one of the pitfalls of their ideologies fundamentally. And you see this with Marxist-Leninist socialists and people like
Yeah.
that, where they're way too absolutist, right? They're way too absolutist, right?
Yeah.
It's probably never going to be the case that there is one specific way that we should structure the entirety of the economy. And when David Friedman, obviously, he advocates for a total privatization of anything, even the court system. It's
Yeah.
like, well, if you're being that absolutist, it's going to be seriously easy to point out probably some major flaws. Where at least from my perspective, you can be quite flexible and just kind of say, well, we want essentially we want the government institutions that are good and we want the private institutions that are good, and we don't want the ones that are bad. And it turns out a lot of countries have been able to strike that balance pretty well.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, um, on David Friedman. So David Friedman, I would say, is not an absolutist. I think like libertarian, like he's not an absolute deontologist. He's a consequentialist with respect to like his libertarian capitalism, right, with his anarcho-capitalism. So he does not just say that people like it's taxation is theft, therefore there should be no government, or like stuff like that, right? He's I think argues in like consequentialist ways. So he again, like he presents like it's like his opposition to like public healthcare and like government intervention in healthcare is like very detailed. His article is like very detailed. I can read that, but it will takes a while. Like he does talk about like information asymmetry, right? Lack of information to consumers in healthcare industry, right? Externalities, public goods
Yeah.
problem,
No, I'm not.
stuff
I'm
like
not saying
that.
that he's not giving a detailed. I mean, you can have a very detailed account of
Yeah.
something. Look at the Das Kapital from Karl Marx.
But,
That's a pretty long
I mean,
book, right?
yeah,
But there's
sure,
probably a
sure.
lot of things in there that
But I mean, look, Das
are
Capital
right.
was like so old, right? I mean, like economic theory changed massively after like Marx, right? Like so, David Friedman, I would say. So this is the I think difference between I think social democrats and I think libertarian capitalists, which is that it's like the the libertarian capitalists emphasize established economic theory like strongly, right? So by established economic theory I mean like stuff like you have like a theory of comparative advantage, which is like David Ricardo stuff, marginalism, right, marginal revolution, Alfred Marshall, J. Vance, and Menger, public choice theory, Buchanan and Tullock, game theory, Harsanyi, right? Price theory, which is again Marshall, and also Hayek, especially after his contributions to socialist calculation debate, right? So the like they emphasize established economic theory, right? And they emphasize less the specific cases, right? Like public housing in Vienna. Social democrats love that stuff, right? Like Vienna seems to be doing fantastic with public housing, right? Like sure, I think I will acknowledge that, sure. But my point is that if established economic theory says that like like if public well-established economic theories, again those basic economic theories, right, say that there's going to be some inefficiencies that we are not seeing, right, I think I would agree with it more. Like sure, public housing in Vienna does seem to be working well, but I think I would think about, okay, what are the opportunity costs, what are the invisible costs there, right? So like I think you talked about like governments allowing for like making medicine for 3 or 4 people who are sick, right? Markets will not allow for that. You say that, right? But my point is, okay, look, there's a cost to that, right? Like making
Mhm.
medicine for three or four
Yeah.
people, right?
But
For few
it sounds
people.
like it sounds like you're creating it sounds like you're creating an economic ideology which is kind of non-falsifiable, right? Because I think that we take Vienna for instance. I'm not incredibly obviously I've heard I've seen the short videos of like Vienna did public housing and everything was awesome, right? I haven't in an in-depth way looked into that. But
Yeah.
let's just take that to be the case, right? And let's just say that, essentially what you're saying is, I get it. There's nothing like apparently wrong with Vienna's public housing. But there's got to be something wrong because it seems like this would disagree with standard economic orthodoxy. Um, but what I would posit is that, well, no, I mean, if there was something really wrong happening in Vienna, I mean, we would see it, right? Like we would see, long wait lists for public housing. We would see, it's a housing reform,
So,
obviously, right? We would see
I mean,
these types of impacts, and insofar as we don't see them, it might. I mean, you should consider it to be maybe the case that, maybe it just works, right? Like it sounds. You know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
yeah,
Like it
yeah,
sounds
of
weird
course.
to say, oh, there
No,
must be something wrong with this, even though we can't see it. Like maybe there's just not anything wrong with
yeah, okay,
it.
okay. What you're saying, yeah, yeah, makes sense. But look, here's my counter to that, right? So
Hmm.
look, Einstein's theory of relativity is like very well established, right? Now, if some specific cases go against that, right? Now, the first, I think, initial view for the experimentalists who are like saying that Einstein's theory of relativity has been shown to be like false or something, right? Or like it's not working here in this location, it's not working, right? The first view generally, given the established theory, well-established theory, is to say it is likely that the experimentalists have some kind of like committed some kind of mistake in the while they are experimenting, right, in their case study, right? But by the way, econoboi, I think like our meeting is going to end in like 2.5 minutes, so let me send you another link of Zoom, right? We can chat further on this. I will remember what I'm saying right now. Okay, let me end
Okay.
the Zoom meeting and I will send you
Sure.
another link. Just a second.